Welcome to In the Spotlight with Quocirca, the definitive podcast on digital disruption in the print industry. I'm Luella Fernandez, Director of Quocirca, and today I'm joined by Rob Clark, Senior Vice President of Epson Europe. Today we'll be discussing business inkjet technology and sustainability in the hybrid workplace. So welcome to the show, Rob. It's great to have you here today.
Hi, Luella. Nice to be with you.
Okay, so before we get into the conversation, I know you've been in the print industry for almost 30 years. So could you tell us a bit about your career history and your role at Epson?
Yeah, sure. So I started working for the Ministry of Defence. I did an electronic engineering apprenticeship working for the Ministry of Defence. And quickly decided that the civil service was not for me. So after the apprenticeship, moved out into the private sector. I worked for a distributor, and then I moved on to work for Epson. I started as product manager for dot matrix printers. I did 10 years working in Epson UK in dot matrix and then in inkjet printers. And then I moved into a role in Epson Europe, and I've run the consumer inkjets, I've run projection, I've run large format, and now, as I say, the senior vice president responsible for all of the sales and marketing for Epson across Europe.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, the theme of this podcast is how business inkjet technology can lower environmental impact. And I was reading the latest green report from Epson, and it's very clear that sustainability runs through the whole business there, I think from people, technology, operations, supply chain, and so on. And it's all focused on reducing environmental impact. So can you talk a bit about sustainability technology from Epson's perspective, particularly around your heat-free inkjet technology and the role it can play in reducing an organization's environmental impact?
So first of all, let me start with going back to those early days working for Epson, because it was in 1993 when Epson launched its first consumer inkjet to the market. And at that point, we introduced a technology based on a piezo crystal, which is a different technology to other printers on the market, other inkjet printers. It uses, as I said, a piezo crystal, and when you put a charge across the crystal changes shape, you take the charge away and it changes back again. And if you put the charge, remove it, add the charge, remove it, you start a pumping mechanism which pumps the ink out. And that in itself, because of the piezo crystal, is actually a very low power technology. And we started with it, as I said, in 93 with our consumer products. As well as being low power, it's very controllable. So we were delivering a very high quality print to the market. And 94, we launched our first photo printer, and moved on to through the consumer range. Actually skipped the business market to start with and went into the large format for the photo and fine arts to start with, and expanded our range into higher end, large format, into commercial, and into even up into the industrial, but all the time using that piezo technology. We've now brought that technology back to the office market, and launched a range of products into the office market, which really focus in and hone in on that sustainability, the low power usage of the piezo crystal and the piezo crystal print head. The latest iteration is as you rightly said, is a heat-free technology. We call it precision core, but the nature of it is that using the piezo crystal, we can lower the power that's used, particularly compared to a laser printer that's heating the toner to fuse it to the paper. With the heat-free technology that we're using, it means much lower power, which means much lower CO2 emissions. It also means a lot less waste, because you don't need to change so many components. You're not using the components through the thermal process that's going on inside a laser. Even compared to other inkjet technologies, it's more efficient and more sustainable. The competitive products on the market use a thermal inkjet technology. As I said, ours is completely cold technology, so even against the inkjet products, it's more sustainable.
Yeah, and it's interesting because we see, particularly now post-pandemic, a lot of organizations are becoming more environmentally conscious, and they're looking for technology that can really help them lower their carbon footprint, reduce their environmental costs, and so on. And it sounds like, Epson's technology really sort of helps businesses really sort of reduce their energy consumption. And, particularly I'm interested in the hybrid workplace, whether you're seeing more interest in this kind of technology from your end user perspective, and whether that's something that you are sort of actively sort of promoting in terms of the benefits around sustainability in the office.
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing to say is that the priority of sustainability has been increasing. So when we're talking to end users about print and sustainability in print, the priority they place on sustainability has increased and increased. It's different across Europe in the different countries. So in the Scandinavian region and in Germany, it's been a high priority for quite a while, and that's spread now across the rest of Europe. They are still running at different pace, but we are seeing that priority increase across the entire region. When it comes to our resellers need to be able to demonstrate the technology and really show that the sustainability is something that the end user can trust in. So we're providing a lot of tools to them to help them explain the message and explain the sustainability arguments. With regard to working from home, certainly we're seeing an increase in the requirement for print in the home, and that means a distributed print fleet out in the home office environment, which in itself means that we need to be able to provide a full range of products from A3 all the way down to the A4 product for working in that environment. So it's something that has increased over time because of the prioritization, and I think the proliferation of product into the home, business product into the home, because of the work from home that we're now seeing, requires that larger range.
Okay. Yeah, so HP recently announced it's exiting the business inkjet market, and clearly this has opportunities for Epson. So can you talk a bit about how you're responding to that and your continued commitment to business inkjet technology?
Yeah, I mean, we do see that this is going to have a positive impact for us. Both HP and us were taking the inkjet message to the marketplace. We're focusing very heavily on the sustainability message, and I know that was part also of HP's sell. So there are many customers that are out there that have bought into the idea of sustainable inkjet technology, and that means that there are customers out there that actually have nowhere to go if they want to remain with that message that they've bought into, other than moving across to Epson technology. So from our point of view and from our channel's point of view, this really is an opportunity for us to take the Epson message to more customers.
Yeah, and could you give a bit of insight around what this really means for your channel? So you mentioned that you're really looking for channel partners who are able to articulate that sustainability proposition, and you mentioned that you provide tools and support for the channel. Is there anything in particular that you're seeing in terms of the response from the channel to actually capitalize on that opportunity from HP exiting the business inkjet market? Are you already sort of seeing some movement there and some interest from your channel partners, and will you be recruiting more as a result?
Yeah, we've been recruiting resellers over the last 3 or 4 years as we've expanded our office range. And really we're looking for resellers that understand how sustainability can be important to their customers, and in fact how it changes the conversation that they have with those customers. So rather than simply going in and offering another laser product at a cheaper price or a cheaper CPP, actually they can move the conversation to something different, which is about the policies for sustainability in the office and how those are being implemented by the customers. So as we talk with resellers, it's actually very interesting to receive the feedback from them, and it's quite quick that we can tell whether this is going to be a reseller that we can really partner with and work with. Those that actually understands the messaging and how it can help them and their customers with their sustainability requirements. I'm sure there will be a number of HP resellers that will have bought into the messaging of inkjet and sustainability. And in fact, we're already receiving inquiries from some resellers looking for something to enable them to continue taking that message to market. So yes, definitely it's something that we'll be looking at. We do have a good range of resellers already, so we won't be taking on lots more, but here and there may be places where we have the opportunity to expand the reseller base by working with some of those ex-HP resellers.
Yeah, and I guess it's very much about sort of encouraging your resellers to make that shift from price-based to value-based sales. And could you talk a bit about because I think there are sort of some key differentiators around sort of Epson's technology, and you kind of touched on it earlier, but around the low intervention because of the RIPS model that you use with the replaceable ink packs, which I think is really great, particularly for home workers as well as in the business space. And maybe there's opportunities around there for resellers to extend their MPS contracts to the home. And also the other side in terms of, the kind of, I suppose, innovation around the actual technology, reducing energy consumption and so on. So yeah, maybe you could just give a bit of insight in terms of that shift from that price-based to value-led approach.
Sure. So, as I said, we are looking for resellers where we can have a partnership and where we can work with them to deliver those messages to the market and to the end users. And the messages are based around, number one, sustainability, but talking about low intervention in itself is a sustainability message, or it can be a sustainability message. The fact that we are heat-free, the fact that we are not causing thermal stress in the engine means that the number of components that have to be replaced is fewer than in a laser printer. And also because we're using ink rather than toner, the capacity of our ink bags, as they are actually, is significantly, or can be significantly higher than an equivalent laser. So certainly for many customers, the possibility of having a printer which can be, in fact, in some cases, fit and forget. It's installed and it has enough ink. For example, 80,000 pages worth of ink. It has enough ink to take them for a long time in their contract without having to replace that. And particularly if you're in, for example, a retail environment where you have many stores, you'll have a head office that will have the IT guys in it. But in the stores, they rely on the store manager or the store staff to replace consumables. The last thing you want is a product that needs constant maintenance and consumable replacement. So the RIPS products with those bags, with the 80,000 pages, with the low intervention of the parts that are required, means that the store staff can get on with what they should be doing, which is selling through the store rather than dealing with the maintenance of the product. So low intervention, as I said, it's a very, very key message for us. And in terms of our channel, the low intervention means that from their point of view, they can service far more product far more of their installed base with the service team that they have, because they are servicing them much less often.
Yeah, so I really like that sort of fit and forget kind of approach to printing, because I think there's always a perception that it does require more maintenance, and particularly with supplies replenishment and so on. So I think that Epson's proposition around that has benefits, like you say, in terms of reducing IT burden as well as improving environmental impact. So in terms of, if we could just go back to that sort of hybrid workplace opportunity. So are you seeing now, in terms of the return to the office, we're seeing perhaps more of a move to agile working, where workers are perhaps not going back to work full time, but still working a couple of days at home, a few days in the office. And we're seeing as a result a real shift from the need to have a centralized A3 copier based fleet and moving more to this distributed A4 model. And I know that plays very well to Epson's proposition around its workforce portfolio. So I'm just curious as to whether you've seen changes there from your customers and how you're working with your channel to adapt to this new work environment.
Yeah, we've certainly seen changes. As we went into the pandemic, we saw a huge increase in the demand for work from home, which meant that print was very high on the agenda, and printers were very high on the agenda for putting together a working from home environment. I think initially it was any printer that people could get their hands on, but moving forward, as we go into this real hybrid working, the agile working situation, actually what we'll find is that companies will see that they really need to manage that much more distributed fleet than they've had before. Those printers that are in people's homes, they'll want to be part of their overall managed fleet. So even to the point that they may want to have them on managed print service contracts. And so the shift to agile working will mean that the A4 range, with the capability to have tracking and MPS management, will become much more of a requirement. And we're already seeing that move when we talk to large corporate accounts, where they want to be able to roll out a managed fleet rather than an unmanaged fleet to their home workers.
Yeah, and I think it seems that Epson's very well positioned in terms of having that broad portfolio across the consumer sort of home SOHO market, as well as the enterprise space now. And I think, there's very few vendors that have that kind of full portfolio. So would you say that you're capitalizing on that in any way in terms of how you're seeing your customers procure print technology? So we've seen in our recent research around home printing that, as you mentioned, at the beginning of the pandemic, employees were buying their own devices rather than the employers providing that. And then there's been a bit of a shift to some organizations actually procuring office printers as well as home printers on, sort of online marketplaces such as Amazon and so on. So yeah, just interested in how Epson is building its kind of e-commerce strategy around that to kind of target both the home workers and the office workers.
Yeah, so our range of products goes all the way from consumer into what we call Office Basic, and then into our full office range. At the top of the range, we have the A3 and higher end A4 devices, and they really are for the domain of the resellers. But lower down the range, we still have full range of A4 product that is available to those resellers, but also through other channels, be that other resellers or online. So, the opportunity for the wider reseller base to get involved with the Epson range is certainly there. And the range is a very large range, that's a very extensive portfolio of product that they can buy into. So and it's not just in the home office where we're seeing this more distributed print. Obviously, as there are less people in offices, by the fact that there are people working from home, there's less people working in the office, which means that perhaps that big centralized device is not as necessary as it has been in the past. And in fact, one of the big pushes that we were taking to our resellers even before the pandemic was, is it really necessary to have that centralized A3 device? The move towards centralization was driven by manufacturers and by resellers rather than by the requirement of the actual user. So giving the capability to have a distributed fleet because of its low intervention means that now we can deliver print exactly where it's required to those users in the office rather than them having to get up and go to a centralized device. So both in terms of office print and home print, we're seeing the more distributed nature starting to permeate through the whole organization.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point, actually, is this disconnect between the requirements of the IT decision maker or the IT manager and that of the actual end user, that, the actual worker who's using the device. And it's very much about now giving capabilities to that end customer rather than the IT manager who's managing it. Obviously, they still need to manage the devices, but we've seen a disconnect between their expectations of how print is used and how actual users want to use print. And I think, what you've said there is it's very similar to how OEMs or the print manufacturers have actually developed this A3 strategy around how they can produce the devices and actually have those placed within MPS contracts as well. So, yeah, I think that's a really good point. And we're just seeing now, since the pandemic, that kind of influence is really changing in terms of who's making the decisions about what devices, not just in print, but other technology. We're seeing a lot of shadow IT in terms of users buying their own, whether it's smartphones or their own applications. And I think print is also there. But I think if they've got an awareness around, what the impact of buying their own devices are, particularly with respect to sustainability, I think that will also influence them in their business lives and their decisions around business purchasing. So this leads us nicely to discuss the Usain Bolt partnership. You've just announced him as an ambassador for Epson. Could you give a bit of insight into the motivation for working with Usain?
He's an extremely iconic figure. Everybody knows him. And, when we look into who could possibly be the ambassador, the positivity around him and, his achievements is very, very high. And his ethics are very similar to ours. We're working with him and his foundation as well to be part of that. So it started as a consumer ambassadorial role, but it will, I'm sure, over time, it will develop into not just the consumer, but into the business side, and maybe projection or scan, or and he will be the ambassador for a much larger part of the portfolio than just the consumer piece. And of course, we're all consumers at the end of the day. So, it touches all of us. And we see that ambassadorial role take shape.
Yeah, and I think it's very much, like you say, we're in this kind of B2B to C kind of era now. And, I think this partnership with Usain Bolt really has the opportunity for Epson to sort of build that halo effect around its products in the business space as well. So it'd be really interesting to see how that, sort of impacts your business sales and opportunities as well. But, I think it's a really great partnership. Yeah, so Epson obviously has this real sort of strong sustainability focus around business inkjet technology, but I know you've got Paper Lab as well, which is all around recycling of paper. So could you give a bit of information on how that developed and where that is in the market today?
Yeah, this is a really interesting product. And I have to say, as I said earlier, I've been working in the print industry for many years, and I've worked for Epson for quite a while as well. This product has had the most interest of any product that we've launched, I think. This is a product that will take in printed paper at one end, and it will spit out clean paper at the other end. So, the whole idea of being able to close that circle and provide the print, but also provide the device that turns it back into clean paper. That's really the basis of what this is all about. And it's really sparked the imagination of people, because they see this as a little bit of the elephant in the room. We are now able to use paper, and on site we can then turn it back into clean paper. And it's been a really interesting development for us, and it really has captured the imagination of many of our customers.
So you've talked a bit about the heat-free technology and the energy benefits and sustainability improvements that can be made from using inkjet technology. And I think in the business environment, there's always been perhaps a barrier to adoption because of the perceived quality around inkjet versus laser. And how has that changed over the past year? And is it now really on a par in terms of inkjet versus laser technology?
Yeah, I talked a lot about the way that we moved through our consumer and then skipped the office and went to large formats and into commercial and industrial. And actually, that skipping of the office was down to, first of all, the fact that we were focusing on photography and the photography quality. So when we went into large format, it was about photo and fine art. The difficulty when you came to the office market is that we're printing on plain paper rather than coated paper. So actually what we were doing in that time, whilst we were focusing on large format and commercial and industrial, was developing ink technology that enabled us to print on any media type. So it doesn't matter now whether it's plain paper, we can still create extremely good quality output, which can rival laser. They are slightly different in their, one is slightly more glossy, the laser comes out slightly more glossy, but in terms of the actual quality, the quality has now caught up through the developments in ink chemistry. So those developments have enabled us to overcome that barrier, and it's being adopted as we're seeing now in the office market because we've overcome that quality issue.
Are there any particular vertical markets that Epson's more dominant in, or are seeing more success in terms of adoption of business inkjet technology?
Yeah, it started with markets that you would imagine would be interested in sustainability, ecology, low emissions. So the education market, the healthcare market, they were two of our initial target markets, and they really took up the sustainability and ecology messaging. But I have to say, as I mentioned earlier, that the prioritization of sustainability has moved up the list. And so now we're seeing every area of the market interested in seeing what ecological printing, sustainable printing is all about. So I wouldn't say there's one particular target or a few particular targets anymore. It started with healthcare and education, but it's expanded since then.
And so what's next for Epson in terms of its strategy for 2022? Is there anything in particular you would be focusing on?
Yes, so the expansion of the range, I think, is the main thing for us. We have products that are up to 24 ppm, and then we that actually when they print, because they have no warm-up time, can compete with a 40 ppm laser. And then we have products 60 ppm, 75 and 100. So for us to fill out that middle range really is where we're looking at. That's our focus to expand the range there.
Yeah. So do you have any predictions in terms of which trends you think will really have an impact on the industry in the next year?
Yeah, I think we've already touched on it, to be honest with you. We were talking about the shift towards agile working and how that's going to change the market. I think that new norm, as we're calling it, really is the area that is going to expand for the printing marketplace. For the end corporate customers to really get to grips with what is going to be required for them to manage such a distributed workforce. That's really going to be the key, I think, over the coming year or so. And that will include everything from the workstation through to print. So that, I think, is the area of focus.
Yeah, so that's been a really great conversation, Rob. It's been really interesting to hear about Epson's strategy, its response to HP exiting the business inkjet market, but also learn more about the sustainability benefits around Epson's heat-free inkjet technology, particularly around low intervention, reduced energy usage, but also opportunities for the channel to build their sustainability proposition. So many thanks again for joining me today, Rob. I really appreciate you taking the time to join today's podcast.
All right. Thanks a lot, Laurel.
So thank you for joining today's In the Spotlight with Quocirca episode. For more information, please go to quocirca.com or subscribe to our YouTube channel. Thanks again, and I look forward to seeing you in the next episode.